Welcome. We invite you today, as always, to reflect with us and pray on a reading from St. John's Gospel. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw signs that he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The feast of the Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" And he said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have even a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. And then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. And when the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord. There are many ways we can pray and reflect on Scripture, and one of them is to put ourselves in the scene and take on one of the roles of the people involved. And today I'm suggesting that we become one of the disciples, a group of, in this case, men who were fishermen, who lived simple, quiet lives until Jesus came upon them and invited them to follow him. And so they were in a situation that was relatively new to them. Jesus, going up this mountain, has this huge crowd following him because they were excited about his teaching, but more even about the miracles that he was working. And when the disciples saw the large number of people, they became panicked, overwhelmed, not knowing what they were supposed to do, but they were compassionate. And so they said to the Lord, "Lord, how can we feed this number?" They took on that kind of responsibility. And Jesus says to them, how much do you have? He said, "We have nothing. There's a boy here, though, who has 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" And then Jesus simply says, "Have them recline." So the disciples have the crowd sit down on the hillside. And then Jesus says, "Go and distribute what you have." And they go. Now, I would imagine if I was one of them, I have a little bit of bread and fish, and I'm going around, and all of a sudden I become aware that something extraordinary is happening, that the reserves aren't dwindling, that I'm winding up with at least as much as I began with. It's got to be confusing, to say the least. I know I didn't do anything. And finally it dawns on me, this must be the Lord's answer. And they wound up with 12 baskets filled of fragments from what they had begun with. An extraordinary moment. I would imagine the crowd wasn't even aware in the beginning of what had happened. There were just too many, and they were getting fed, and they were satisfied. But now they realized what an extraordinary event had come, that something or someone was in their midst, taking care of them. It's an extraordinary moment of awareness, of miracle. But at the same time, the teaching of Jesus is not about the miracle. For God, that is not a great act. But what he's challenging, I think, is the disciples saying to them, can you feed these people? And they said, no, we have no resources. We're helpless. It's more than we can deal with. And then Jesus says, okay, just do what I tell you. Use what you have. And there is the gift of faith. There maybe is the miracle, actually, that these disciples, simple as they were, had really fundamental faith in Jesus and his presence. And while they didn't understand, they understood enough that they would do what he said, even though I imagine they were wondering if he really knew what he was doing. That kind of reaction resonates with me as we're in the midst of this coronavirus, that so many things are impiling on us, causing us to feel helpless, overwhelmed indeed. How can we feed ourselves? How can we keep ourselves sane? How can we keep those of you with children and with family members quarantined together? How do you remain sane? How do you keep seeing one another day in and day out? What are you supposed to do, especially with children? Can we make them happy? Can we make the time less threatening? All of those challenges. And I think Jesus might be saying to us in his low-key manner, just use what you have and then trust me. What we have is ourselves. We have our sensitivity. We have our faith. We have our compassion. We each of us have gifts, not to compare one with the other. But the fact is that if I use what I have, God will bring about the nurturing and the feeding of those around me, not only with family members and those who are geographically quarantined with me, but other people through texting, through phone calls, through any way that I can reach out and let them know that they're being cared for, that God has not abandoned them, the God who we believe is a God of love. In order for me to do that, in order for me to be focused, I need to pray. I need to remember that I'm not alone. I need to remember several things about this gospel today, not the least of which is to do what I am told, to use what I have, even though it may seem that I'm overwhelmed, and then use it in generosity, sharing it with everyone that I come into contact with in ways that I can do. It may not be overwhelmingly impressive to other people, but it will make a difference. And like the crowd, we won't find the difference until later. Jesus asks then for us to trust him, to use what we have with confidence and faith that we're not alone. And then he asks us to be patient, as faith always requires. Patient, loving, doing what we can, feeding those around us, feeding ourselves with prayer, and then waiting patiently. And someday it'll all make sense. But until that time, Jesus says, trust me, go with me and let me be with you and witness to my presence. Live your faith by sharing and feeding others. We hope that today continues to be a day of prayer for you, a day of affirmation, that we pray for one another and continue to have faith in our loving God.